Alright, this is going to be the last part of Unit 3 lecture on Chapter 2 and a little bit of Chapter 3. We'll talk about ways in which researchers can study the brain, and then we'll get into evolutionary psychology. So the two most prominent ways in which researchers study the brain is through either lesioning or electrical stimulation. Lesioning is when we destroy part of the brain, or at least part of the brain tissue, in order to see how it affects the organism. And then electrical stimulation is doing the exact opposite. So you're stimulating areas of the brain to see how the brain is affected. We do both of these things most commonly in animals, but they can be done in humans as well. So if you remember in Chapter 2, it's talking about when a reticular formation of a cat was lesioned, they fell into like a deep coma, and when it was stimulated, they were aroused and wide awake. So these are the two best ways in which we can study how the brain is affected through certain things, but we can't always do them in humans. So one of the ways we can do that is through looking at a CAT scan, which uses x-rays to create images of the structures of the brain, whereas an MRI, or magnetic resonance image, uses a magnetic field to take a picture of the brain. MRIs provide much greater detail than CAT scans. We can also study the brain through an EEG, which provides a record of electrical activity of neurons that are found just below the surface of the skull. An fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance, uses the magnetic fields in the same way that an MRI does, but it goes a step further and pieces the pictures together to show how the brain is changing over time. And then a PET scan involves injecting a person with a low dose of radioactive substance and then recording the activity of that substance in the person's brain. So at the top left, you have the EEG, which these electrical nodes are providing stimulation of neurons, and we're going to be looking at how they are affected. The bottom series of pictures would be a functional MRI, so it's pictures that have been taken of the brain over time, and it's showing in this instance which areas of the brain are lighting up. And in the top right picture, that's a PET scan. The black dots you see are where the radioactive substance is going to in this person's body, and PET scans are often used to detect cancer, and then also they can be used in the brain to see which areas of the brain are activated when humans are doing certain tasks. So jumping over to Chapter 3 on evolutionary psychology, part of biological psychology is studying the differences in humans, specifically looking at nature versus nurture and how much of our makeup comes from heredity versus the environment. Heritability refers to the extent to which differences among people are attributed to genes. So if you look at a population's height, the differences that we will find in those individuals' height is attributed to genes. About 90% of it is attributed to genes, which is a good argument for the nature piece of the debate. When we look at genes, or what we know to be our codes of life, chromosomes contain DNA. And within DNA, you have your genes, which makes up your development from conception. The genome is the set of complete instructions for making up an organism. So it contains all the genes within that organism. It's also what makes our genetic code, or genome, as humans different from the genome of a common housefly. Evolutionary psychologists really like to look at twin biology because twins share the same genetic makeup, but they may or may not share the nurture part of things. So studying the effects of heredity and environment on two sets of twins, we can use identical versus fraternal twins. And really, identical twins are more often used in studying twin biology, but fraternal twins can give us a lot of information too. And specifically, what researchers are interested in are twins that have been separated at birth. A number of studies show that despite not having the same environment, identical twins raised separately from birth are very similar to one another, especially in personality and intelligence, their interests and their fears, and also even biological. They share biological similarities in brain waves and heart rate. The story of the two Jims in your book is really interesting. Jim Lewis is middle class. He has a wife named Betty, son named James Allen, a dog named Toy. He likes to woodwork. He's a chain smoker, bites his fingernails, drove a Chevy, and had high blood pressure and migraines. He found out in 1980 that he has a separated twin named Jim Springer, and everything down to the dog's name was the exact same between these two individuals who shared the same genetic makeup but not the same environment. Specifically, their sons' names were both James Allen, just spelled differently, and when played their voices, they would mistake themselves for their twins, so they could not identify themselves on an audio recording. They were the first in one of many twin studies that compared identical twins who were reared separately from birth. There are some critics of separated twin studies. A lot of people say, well, if you take anybody, two individuals within the environment, they're going to have a lot of similarities, despite the fact that they're complete strangers. However, researchers point out that the difference between fraternal twins are much greater than identical twins, which proves that genetic part of things. Researchers also like to look at adoption studies because adoption studies, as opposed to twin studies, suggest that adoptees are more similar to their biological parents than their adoptive parents. So they share the same genetic makeup as their biological parents, but they're reared in an environment in which they're surrounded by people who do not share their same genetic makeup. And adoptive studies have shown that children of adoptive parents are more different to those adoptive parents than to their biological parents. What's important to remember in evolutionary psychology is this gene-environment interaction. Genes can influence traits which affect responses, and then the environment can also affect genetic activity. A really good example of this, if you take a child who's very restless and hyperactive, is probably that personality or that behavior is going to evoke an angry response of his parents. So let's say he's getting in trouble in school, he can't sit down in his seat. The parents are going to become kind of angry with this child or question him, why can't you just sit down? Why can't you stop talking? That stressful environment that child's going to be put in, whether at school or at home, can then trigger his genetic makeup to manufacture more neurotransmitters that could lead him to experiencing depression, like serotonin. So it's very important to look at how genes can affect the environment and how the environment can affect our genetic makeup. Another good example of this is handedness. We know that throughout history, being right-handed has been preferred in our environment. However, handedness is inherited. There is a genetic component to it. And what this suggests is that genes can simply influence handedness, but really it's the environment in which we live in that can also have a big impact on which hand you write with. We live in a right-handed world, and most people who are born using their left hand mostly, especially as a young child, end up being very ambidextrous because they have to adapt to the environment in which they live in. So constantly think about this nature versus nurture piece. We'll always come back to it no matter what we're studying, if it's personality or intelligence or abnormal disorders that are found within people. It's very important to remember that both genes and the environment play a hand in who we are as humans. Thanks, guys.